Stop crying, you pathetic child. Your tears annoy me. I only married you to secure your father's territory, and now that he's dead, you are completely worthless to me. Get out of my sight before I make you regret being born.
He thought his words would break her forever. Instead, they cured her. She severed their spiritual bond that very night and vanished into the human city. And the man who spoke those words spent the next 3 years learning, one unbearable day at a time, exactly what he had thrown away. Before we get into how it all began, I want to invite you to do 2 things. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because we bring you a brand new story just like this one every single week, and you will not want to miss the next one. Second, drop a comment below and let me know. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who made you feel worthless, just to finally feel like yourself again? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your story too. Now, let's begin. Elena Marchetti was 23 years old when her father, Antonio Marchetti, called her to his bedside for what both of them silently understood would be one of their last conversations. He was dying slowly, the way strong men sometimes do. His once broad shoulders thinned by an illness the pack healers had no cure for, and his hands, when they closed around hers, trembled with an effort that broke her heart more than any of his actual words did. The Marchetti family had never been wolves themselves. They were something rarer and, in the old hierarchies of the northern packs, something almost as valuable. Human landholders whose family had controlled the vast, ancient timberlands bordering 3 separate pack territories for 6 generations, land so strategically vital that entire wars had once been fought over smaller parcels of it. Antonio Marchetti had spent his life carefully balancing alliances with the packs around him, and as his own death approached, his single greatest fear was not dying. It was leaving his only daughter unprotected in a world where land like theirs made a young woman without a wolf's strength behind her an irresistible target. "I have arranged your bonding to Alpha Damien Voss," he told her that evening, his voice raspy but resolute. "I know this was not the life we once dreamed for you, Cara mia. I know you wanted to choose for yourself, the way your mother and I chose each other. But the Voss pack is strong and disciplined, and I believe, in time, Damien will come to see what a treasure he has been given in you. I would not leave this earth in peace otherwise." Elena did not argue with her dying father. She held his hand, and she promised him she would be strong, and she let herself believe, because believing was easier than grieving 2 losses in the same season, that perhaps her father was right, that in time, a cold young Alpha might learn to see her. Antonio Marchetti passed away 11 days later, in the depths of a bitter northern winter, and Elena buried him on a hillside overlooking the same timberlands he had spent his whole life protecting. Alpha Damien Voss stood beside her at the funeral, tall and composed in his formal black furs, accepting condolences from visiting pack dignitaries with practiced, unreadable grace. He did not once take Elena's hand. He did not once look at her the way a new husband looks at a grieving wife. And as the first shovel of dark earth struck her father's casket, Elena overheard Damien's senior advisor murmur quietly to another council member, just a few feet away, clearly believing she was too consumed by grief to hear. "Now that the old man is finally gone," the advisor said, "the Alpha won't need to keep up the act much longer." Elena did not turn to confront him. She stood perfectly still, snow gathering silently on the black wool of her coat, and something in her chest, something young and hopeful that had survived even her father's death intact, quietly, permanently closed its door. The years that followed unfolded with a coldness so consistent it eventually stopped even surprising her. Damien Voss, it turned out, had never intended to be a husband in any real sense of the word. He was, first and always, an alpha consolidating power, and Elena Marchetti's inherited timberlands were, in his eyes, simply the final piece of a decade-long strategy to expand Voss Pack's borders without firing a single arrow. The marriage was a transaction. Elena was the paperwork required to complete it. He forgot her birthday 3 years running, a small cruelty that somehow cut deeper than the larger ones, because it required so little effort to prevent, and he never once bothered to make it. At the grand seasonal galas the northern packs held to display their strength and alliances to one another, he seated her at the far end of the long banquet table, near the kitchen doors, while he danced, publicly, unapologetically, with visiting lunar candidates from allied packs, women whose bloodlines carried the wolf strength Elena's never would. When she once suggested, gently, over a rare shared breakfast, that she might redecorate one small unused parlor in the vast Voss manor, he told her, without even glancing up from his correspondence, that he saw no reason to spend money accommodating the tastes of a placeholder wife. The word placeholder became something she heard so often, in so many disguised forms, that it began to feel less like an insult and more like a diagnosis of her entire existence within those manor walls. Her only true comfort during those years came from an elderly pack housemaid named Greta, a woman who had served the Voss family for nearly 4 decades and had watched 3 alphas grow into their power, each one crueler than the last, in her private and unspoken opinion. Greta brought Elena tea in the evenings when the manor grew silent and cold, sat with her by the fire, and never once told her to simply endure it, the way so many other pack wives around them seemed to expect of a woman in her position. "You are not a placeholder, Clara," Greta told her once, fierce as a much younger woman despite her age. "You are a Marchetti. Your family owned land before his family owned a single acre of it. Don't you dare let a man who cannot even remember your birthday convince you that you are less than what you are." Elena began, in the privacy of a small leather journal Greta had given her, to write down not her sorrows, but her plans, small observations about the family's textile trade, ideas about efficient production, quiet dreams of a life where her worth was not determined by a man's convenience. She did not yet know what those pages would eventually become. She only knew that writing them down felt, for the first time in years, like breathing. The cruelty reached a new and unmistakable clarity at the Voss Pack's annual midwinter gala, an event so grand that alphas from 4 surrounding territories traveled for days to attend, all of them eager to display their wealth, their strength, and their carefully cultivated alliances to one another beneath the manor's towering chandeliers. Elena stood near the edge of the ballroom that night in a gown she had chosen carefully, hoping, one final foolish hope, that some flicker of pride might cross her husband's face when he saw her. Instead, Damien crossed the room directly to a visiting alpha's daughter, a striking young wolf named Serena, and introduced her to his entire assembled council with a warmth Elena had never once received in 3 years of marriage. "This," Damien said, his hand resting at the small of Serena's back with an easy familiarity that turned every head in the room, is the kind of Luna Voss Pack actually deserves. He said it 3 feet from where Elena stood. He said it loud enough that at least a dozen pack wives turned, almost in unison, to gauge her reaction, their expressions caught somewhere between pity and cruel amusement. Elena did not flinch. She did not let her composure crack, not even slightly, not even as 3 of those pack wives drifted closer over the following hour to needle her with pointed, poisonous small talk about how fortunate she was that the alpha had married her despite everything, their smiles never once faltering as they delivered each small cut. It was only later, alone in a darkened side hallway far from the music and the chandeliers, that Elena finally allowed herself 30 seconds. She counted them, deliberately, the way she had learned to count them after that first humiliating gala 2 years earlier. 30 seconds of silent tears against the cold stone wall, before she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her gown, and returned to the party with a smile so flawless that no one watching would have guessed anything at all had happened. It was on her walk back toward the ballroom that she passed close enough to an open study door to hear Damien's voice, low and confident, addressing his beta. The moment the Marchetti land transfer is legally finalized next month, he was saying, entirely unaware she was near enough to hear every word, the marriage becomes little more than decorative paperwork. Paperwork I can, in time, quietly erase. Elena kept walking. But something inside her, for the first time in 3 long years, had finally stopped absorbing the cruelty and started, quietly, counting the days until she would no longer need to. The confrontation that changed everything happened 4 days later, on an ordinary grey evening that gave no warning of the significance it would come to hold. Elena had spent those 4 days turning the study conversation over in her mind, searching for some interpretation that might soften it, some context that might make decorative paperwork I can eventually erase mean something less final than it sounded. She found none. And so, against every instinct that 3 years of caution had trained into her, she went to Damien's private study that evening and asked him, directly, whether he intended to set her aside once the land transfer was complete. She had hoped, she would later admit to herself, for one last flicker of the man her father had believed existed somewhere beneath the alpha's cold exterior. Some hesitation, some flash of guilt, some small acknowledgement that 3 years of marriage, however loveless, had built something between them worth protecting. What she received instead was the cruelest, most complete rejection of her entire life. Damien rose from his desk, his expression twisting with an irritation that had clearly been simmering beneath his composure for far longer than Elena had ever realized, and he did not soften a single word of what came next. "Stop crying, you pathetic child," he said, though she had not yet shed a single tear, the accusation itself designed to shame her before she had even given him reason to. "Your tears annoy me. I only married you to secure your father's territory, and now that he's dead, you are completely worthless to me. Get out of my sight before I make you regret being born." The words landed with a violence that had nothing to do with physical force and everything to do with the precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed, at least in the privacy of his own mind, exactly how little he thought of her. Elena stood in the doorway of that study, and she felt the last 3 years of small, absorbed cruelties gather themselves into a single, unmistakable truth. This man would never, under any circumstance, come to see her worth. He had already decided, long before tonight, that she had none. Damien turned back to his desk without waiting to see whether she obeyed his command to leave, already dismissing her from his attention as completely as he had dismissed her from his life. Elena did not cry. She did not shake. She stood perfectly still in that doorway for a long moment, and something in her chest, the last small, hopeful ember of a girl who had once believed her father's dying wish might come true, went suddenly, permanently quiet, the way a house goes quiet after the final guest has finally, mercifully gone home. There is an old ritual among the northern packs, one spoken of only in careful, hushed tones, because it is rarely performed and even more rarely survived with any dignity intact. A mate bond once formed can be severed, but only by the one who has been rejected, and only through a ritual so ancient and so painful that most who attempt it are warned away by pack elders who consider the cost too steep. Elena had learned of the ritual years earlier, tucked away in one of her father's old texts on pack law, long before she ever imagined needing it for herself. That night, after Damien's final words had finished echoing through the cold stone halls of Voss Manor, she did not weep, did not rage, did not seek out anyone to comfort her. She walked alone through the falling snow to the small stone chapel that stood at the edge of the Marchetti timberlands, the last remaining piece of her father's legacy that Damien's advisers had not yet fully absorbed into Voss Pack's holdings, and there, by candlelight at midnight, she performed the severing. The pain was immediate and total, a burning thread pulled slowly and deliberately out of her chest, and Elena bore it the way she had learned to bear everything in that manner over the last 3 years, silently, with her spine straight and her jaw set, refusing to give the pain the satisfaction of a single cry. By dawn, it was finished. The bond that had once, faintly, connected her to Damien Voss was gone. She returned to the manor only long enough to gather one small suitcase. Old Greta was waiting for her in the servants' entrance, her weathered face etched with a grief that held no surprise in it at all, as though she had been quietly expecting this moment for years. "I have some savings," Greta said, pressing a small worn envelope into Elena's hands with a firmness that left no room for refusal. "It is not much, Clara, but it is honest money, and it is yours. Wherever you go, go all the way. Don't look back even once. Not for this house, not for this pack, and certainly not for that man." Elena embraced the old woman tightly, and by the time the first light of dawn broke over the timberlands, she was already walking across the border of Voss Pack territory, one suitcase in hand, toward a train station and a city she had never once visited but somehow already knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman finally choosing her own life, would become her home. She did not see what happened back at the manor in that same grey dawn light. She did not see Damien Voss wake suddenly in his bed, gasping, one hand clutched to his chest as though something vital had just been torn loose from inside him, with absolutely no understanding, yet, of what he had just lost. New York City, in those first weeks, offered Elena Marchetti something she had never once experienced in 26 years of life. Complete and total anonymity. No pack elders whispering about her worth. No gala guests measuring her against visiting lunar candidates. No husband correcting her for speaking above her station. She was, for the first time, simply a woman with a suitcase, a small envelope of savings, and absolutely no one waiting to judge whether she deserved to exist in the room she was standing in. The early months were not glamorous. She rented a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, the constant hum of industrial dryers becoming an oddly comforting white noise as she fell asleep each night. She took the first job she could find, folding and cataloging inventory at a modest textile importer near the garment district, work so far beneath her intelligence that her new co-workers occasionally joked, not unkindly, that she seemed hopelessly overqualified for stacking bolts of fabric. It was there, within her first 2 months, that Elena noticed something her employer had entirely overlooked: a chronic inefficiency in how the company sourced and tracked its raw materials, one that was quietly costing them nearly 11% of their annual margin. She drafted a proposal in her small apartment over several sleepless nights, presented it to her employer with the same quiet composure she had once used to survive humiliating pack galas, and watched his skeptical expression shift, slowly, into something like genuine respect. Within 6 months, she had been promoted twice. Within a year, she had saved enough to move into a slightly larger apartment and begun sketching, in the margins of Greta's old leather journal, ideas for a company entirely her own. The day she opened her first bank account listing no name but her own, Elena Marchetti, and no one else's, she stood at the counter of that small downtown branch for a long moment after the teller handed back her documents, simply looking at her own name in black ink, feeling something unlock quietly in her chest that 3 years of marriage had kept firmly, coldly shut. Back within the cold stone halls of Voss Manor, something was wrong with the Alpha, and no one, not his healers, not his advisors, not Damien himself, could initially explain what it was. It began subtly. A persistent exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to resolve. A dull, constant ache beneath his ribs that felt, disturbingly, less like injury and more like absence, as though some organ he had never known he depended on had quietly stopped functioning. His shift, once effortless and commanding, began to falter. His wolf refusing, for the first time in his adult life, to fully answer his call, as though some essential piece of the connection between man and beast had been severed. Damien, in the early months, refused to entertain any explanation that did not involve enemies, curses, or conspiracy. He accused 3 separate allied packs of poisoning him. He demanded his healers run test after test, growing increasingly furious each time they found nothing physically wrong with him. He blamed the stress of managing Voss packs' expanding territory. He blamed, privately, everyone and everything except the one explanation his pride refused to let him consider. It was the pack's eldest healer, a woman who had served 3 generations of Voss Alphas and had seen every manner of wolf ailment in her long career, who finally delivered the news that Damien had spent nearly a year avoiding. "This is not illness, my Alpha," she told him, her voice gentle but unflinching, in the privacy of his own study. "This is a severed bond. Your mate did not simply leave you. She severed the connection between you entirely, a ritual so painful that few attempt it unless they have been given no other choice. And there is no cure for what you are experiencing. Not medicine. Not time. The only path back to your full strength is reconciliation, and reconciliation is only possible if the one who severed the bond chooses, of her own free will, to allow it." Damien sat in stunned silence for a long time after the healer left the room. For the first time since the night he had ordered Elena out of his sight, he allowed himself to fully understand what her absence actually meant. Not merely the loss of the Marchetti land transfer, not merely a minor inconvenience to be quietly managed by his advisors, but the loss of something he had never once bothered to value while it was still entirely, patiently within his reach. His fate, he now understood with a dawning horror that would only deepen over the following years, rested entirely in the hands of the one woman he had spent 3 years calling worthless. 2 years after walking out of Voss Manor with a single suitcase, Elena Marchetti stood in the sunlit lobby of her own company's headquarters, watching a team of 30 employees move purposefully around her, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to marvel at the distance she had traveled. Marchetti and Company had begun as a small proposal scribbled in a second-hand journal and had grown, through Elena's relentless attention to ethical sourcing and genuinely innovative design, into one of the most talked-about boutique textile companies in the country. Her first magazine feature had run 18 months earlier, a modest profile in a regional business journal. By the time of this particular sunlit afternoon, she had been profiled twice by national publications, closed a contract worth well over $1 million with a major department store chain, and been invited to deliver a keynote address, the following month, at one of the country's largest conferences on ethical entrepreneurship. The woman who now moved through that lobby bore only a distant resemblance to the girl who had once counted 30 seconds of permitted tears in a darkened hallway. She stood taller. She spoke with an unhurried confidence that came from having built something entirely her own, brick by careful brick, with no one's permission required. Into this new life had come Marcus Reyes, a kind, steady architect she had met through a mutual business contact, a man entirely outside the world of pacts and bonds and ancient rituals, who treated her with a gentle, uncomplicated warmth that felt, after everything, almost disorienting in its simplicity. He made her laugh. He remembered small details about her days. He represented, Elena knew, a version of love that would never once require her to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's convenience. She had not decided, that sunlit afternoon, whether she loved him. She had also not yet considered that anyone from her old life might ever find her again. She did not know that, an ocean away, a Voss pack scout traveling on unrelated business had recently picked up a national magazine in an airport lounge and gone very still at the sight of a familiar face smiling confidently from its cover. Elena Marchetti, radiant, powerful, and entirely unaware that her old world was about to collide with the one she had built for herself. The photograph reached Damien Voss on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, nearly 3 years to the week since Elena had walked out of his manor at dawn, and something in him that had been slowly hollowing out for years finally, completely broke open. He had spent those 3 years diminished in ways his own pack had learned not to speak of aloud, thinner, grayer, his once commanding presence reduced to something quieter and more careful, a man visibly living with a wound no healer could close. He looked, that afternoon, at the magazine his scout had brought him, at the confident, radiant woman smiling out from its cover, and felt something twist in his chest that was entirely separate from the physical ache of the severed bond, something that felt, unmistakably, like shame. His counsel urged him, in no uncertain terms, not to pursue her. Several advisors worried openly that any attempt to reach out to Elena now, given her sudden and considerable business success, would look exactly like what it had once actually been. An alpha reaching for something valuable he believed belonged to him. Even his own beta, a man who had served him loyally for over a decade, warned him plainly that showing up uninvited in her life might do more damage than the years of silence already had. It was in that private conversation with his beta that Damien said something none of his advisors had ever heard pass his lips in all the years they had known him. "I do not deserve her forgiveness," he said quietly, staring at the magazine cover in his hands. "I am not even certain anymore that I am going to ask for it. I do not want the bond back if she does not want it. I do not want the land. I only want the chance to tell her, to her face, exactly how sorry I am, even if she closes the door on me the moment I finish the sentence." 3 days later, for the first time in his adult life, Damien Voss boarded a commercial flight to New York City entirely alone. No guards, no advisors, no titles or ceremony announcing his arrival. Traveling, for the first time he could remember, as nothing more than an ordinary, powerless man. Elena left her company's headquarters on a bright autumn afternoon, laughing at something one of her senior designers had just said, entirely unprepared for what was waiting on the crowded sidewalk outside. Damien Voss stood among the flow of pedestrians, thinner than she remembered, his once immaculate composure entirely stripped away, and the moment his eyes found hers across that busy street, something in his face crumbled in a way Elena had genuinely never once witnessed in 3 years of marriage to him. He crossed the distance between them, and before she or anyone around her fully understood what was happening, Damien Voss, alpha of Voss Pack, a man who had once told an entire ballroom that another woman was the kind of Luna he actually deserved, dropped to his knees on the crowded public sidewalk in front of dozens of stunned strangers and Elena's own visibly alarmed employees. He pressed his forehead to the hem of her coat, his shoulders shaking with a grief so raw and unguarded that several passers-by actually slowed their steps, uncertain whether they were witnessing a medical emergency or something else entirely. His voice, when it finally came, was barely recognizable as the cold, cutting tone Elena had once memorized so completely. "Please," he said, the single word breaking apart in his throat. "Please, Elena. I am not asking you to come back to me. I am not asking for anything you do not wish to give. I am only asking for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of your time, after everything I took from you, after everything I said. I know I do not deserve even that much." Elena's senior designer moved instinctively to shield her, one hand already reaching for her phone to call security, and for a long, suspended moment Elena stood frozen on that sidewalk, staring down at a man who had once made her count silent tears in darkened hallways, now sobbing openly at her feet in front of the entire world she had built without him. She lifted one hand, gently stopping her designer from calling anyone. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and utterly unreadable, giving no hint at all, to Damien or to anyone watching, of the storm of feeling churning silently beneath her calm exterior. "Not here," was all she said. "My office. Tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. Come alone." Damien arrived the following morning precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed simply, without a single mark of his rank or wealth, and waited in Elena's office with the visible discomfort of a man entirely unaccustomed to sitting somewhere he did not control. Elena entered on her own time, several minutes later, closing the door behind her with a quiet, deliberate click that made clear, immediately, that this conversation would happen entirely on her terms. What followed was not the desperate, disorganized apology Damien had delivered on the sidewalk. It was something slower, more considered, a full accounting of the man he had been, delivered without excuses, without deflection, without a single attempt to soften his own culpability. He told her plainly that he had married her for land and treated her as though her worth began and ended with a legal transaction. He told her he had buried whatever affection might once have existed between them under years of arrogance and a fear of vulnerability. He had never once examined honestly until the bond's absence forced him to. He asked, at the end of it, not for forgiveness, but simply for the chance to prove, through sustained action rather than words, that he understood the depth of what he had done. Elena listened without interrupting him, her expression composed and unreadable in the same way it had been on countless nights she had once returned, flawless-faced, to galas that had just humiliated her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, and the single word carried the full, calm weight of 3 years of accumulated pain. "Words are cheap, Damien, especially beautiful ones delivered by a man who has always known exactly what to say when it finally serves him. I do not doubt that you feel something right now. I do not doubt the bond's absence has taught you real suffering. But I spent 3 years being told, in 100 small ways and one enormous one, that I was worthless, and I will not undo that with a single well-rehearsed apology, however sincerely it was meant. If you want anything from me, prove it. Consistently. Patiently. With no expectation of reward. And do not come back here again until you can." Damien rose slowly, his composure devastated but resolute, and paused at the door before leaving. "Then I will prove it," he said quietly, "however long it takes." He left without another word. Elena sat alone in her office for a long time after the door closed, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not from the old pain, but from something far more frightening and unfamiliar. The terrifying, unwelcome possibility of hope. What followed was not a single grand gesture, but a slow, patient year built entirely out of small, consistent choices. The kind of year that, viewed all at once from its final month, would prove far more convincing than any speech ever could have. Damien relocated to New York quietly, taking a modest apartment far from the fashionable neighborhoods where his old wealth might have made an impression, and accepted an ordinary administrative job under his middle name, deliberately stripping away every advantage his title had ever given him. He did not contact Elena directly. Instead, he began appearing, once a week, at the small coffee shop near her office, always sitting quietly with a book or a newspaper, never once approaching her table, never once making his presence her burden to manage. He funded, anonymously and without any public credit attached to his name, a scholarship program for young women fleeing controlling arranged pack marriages, a cause he now understood with a clarity that had cost him everything to earn. He called old Greta once a month, humbly asking her, again and again, to help him understand the small ways he had failed Elena over the years, absorbing her sometimes harsh honesty without a single word of defensiveness. When Marcus, sensing the shifting ground beneath his own relationship with Elena, confronted Damien directly outside that same coffee shop one afternoon, demanding to know his intentions, Damien did something that surprised even himself. "The decision belongs entirely to her," he said simply. "I have no right to compete for it, and I will not try. If she chooses you, I will accept that, because it will mean she has chosen the life she deserves, whether or not it includes me." Elena, without ever approaching him, without ever acknowledging his presence directly, found herself, over the passing months, quietly aware of exactly which Tuesday afternoons he would appear at that coffee shop, and exactly which Tuesdays he would not. On the 1-year anniversary of her firm refusal in that office, she watched from across the street as Damien rose from his usual table, gathered his coat, and left the coffee shop once again without ever once looking for her, exactly as he had done every single week for the past year. And Elena realized, with a quiet, unsettling clarity, that she was no longer dreading the sight of him. She had started, without ever quite meaning to, looking for him instead. It was Elena, finally, who crossed the street that following Tuesday and sat down, uninvited, at Damien's small corner table. The first time in over a year she had willingly closed the distance between them herself. What followed was the first genuinely unguarded conversation either of them had shared in nearly 4 years. Elena asked him directly whether the physical toll of the severed bond was as painful as she had once quietly hoped it would be during her angriest months alone. Damien answered her honestly, without a trace of manipulation in his voice, describing the ache with the same plain, unflinching acceptance he had shown throughout the entire year, not as a plea for pity, but simply because she had asked for the truth and he had promised, months earlier, to give her nothing else. Elena, in turn, admitted something she had not yet said aloud to anyone, not even Greta. That somewhere over the past year, watching him faithfully appear and faithfully leave without ever once asking anything of her, she had come to a realization that surprised her more than his suffering ever had. Her own healing, she now understood, had never actually depended on his punishment. She had built her entire new life without needing his misery to validate it, and the fact that he had genuinely changed did not diminish anything she had built. It simply meant, perhaps, that there was room now for something new to exist alongside it. Before either of them fully understood the significance of the moment, Elena extended an invitation she had not planned to offer. "My company's anniversary gala is next month," she said. "Not as my mate. Not as anything more than my guest. But I would like you to come." It was, for both of them, a small and monumental step. And it was on the night of that very gala, surrounded by the glittering success Elena had built entirely on her own terms, that Marcus made one final, sincere, heartfelt attempt to win her heart completely, forcing Elena, in front of colleagues, in front of Damien, in front of her entire hard-won world, to make a choice she could no longer quietly postpone. Elena did not make her decision that night in a rush of emotion, surrounded by music and champagne, and the pressure of 2 men waiting for her answer. She made it 3 days later, alone in her office, with the same clear-eyed deliberation she had once used to build an entire company out of a second-hand journal. She called Damien to that same office where she had once told him no, and this time, when she spoke, Her voice carried a different weight entirely. "I am not returning to Voss Manor," she told him plainly. "I am not becoming your Luna again in the way I once was. I will not move back to your territory, and I will not simply restore what we once had, because what we once had nearly destroyed me. What I am choosing instead is this, one imperfect, transformed man, courting a whole and powerful woman, slowly, for as long as it takes to build something real. Something built by my design this time, Damien. Not your convenience." Damien, overwhelmed by gratitude he understood plainly he had not automatically earned, promised her, with a sincerity that finally matched the year of quiet action behind it, that he would spend whatever remained of his life proving her choice correct. But Elena was not finished. "There is one more thing," she said, "before I will even consider reforming the bond between us. You will return to Voss Pack. You will stand before your entire council and household staff, and you will name your cruelty plainly, without a single excuse. You will begin with Greta, and you will make certain that every person you ever diminished in my name understands, clearly, that it will never happen again under your rule." Damien returned to Voss Manor for the first time in over a year, and the transformed Alpha who stood before his own assembled council and household staff bore almost no resemblance to the cold, dismissive man who had once ordered his own wife out of his sight. He named his cruelty in plain, unflinching language, offering no excuses, no deflection, no attempt to soften what he had done. He elevated old Greta, publicly and formally, to a position of genuine respect and lifelong security within the household, acknowledging before the entire pack that her decades of quiet loyalty had gone unrewarded for far too long. He restructured the treatment of every household staff member he had once dismissed with casual contempt, rebuilding, piece by piece, the culture of an entire pack around the values his own suffering had finally taught him. Months later, in a quiet private ceremony that looked nothing at all like the cold political wedding that had once begun this story, Elena and Damien chose, together and on entirely equal footing, to reform the bond between them, not out of obligation, not out of old law, but out of a partnership genuinely rebuilt from its very foundation. Elena continued to run Marchetti and Company. From both her New York headquarters and a beautifully renovated wing of the old manor, which she now co-owned in her own name, on her own terms, for the first time in her life answerable to no one but herself. Damien stood beside her now not as a man securing territory, but as a partner who had learned, at tremendous cost, exactly what it meant to earn a place at someone's side rather than simply assume one. If you have made it this far into Elena and Damien's story, I hope it reminded you of something important. That real love, the kind worth keeping, is never assumed. It is earned, patiently, honestly, one consistent choice at a time, even after the deepest wounds. If this story moved you tonight, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one, and leave a comment below telling me which part of Elena's journey touched you the most. Thank you for spending this time with us, and I will see you in the next story.